spider web is broken. I would like to exchange for new one. This one will do.
After playing Marvel's Spider-Man, I was excited to revisit the world and to play as the newest Spider-Man to that world, Miles Morales. I was very interested to see if the game would be as great as the first, how it would change with a new protagonist, and what kind of story it would tell. Spider-Man Miles Morales definitely has a different feel to it than the first Spider-Man, but do these differences make the game rise to even higher heights, or do they make the game fail to reach the high bar set by the first game? Spider-Man Miles Morales is an open-world action-adventure game developed by Insomniac Games. It was originally released in 2020 for PS4 and PS5, and got a release on PC in 2022. I am playing the PS5 version for this review. It costs $49.99 on both PlayStation and the PC. If you buy digitally on the PlayStation Store, you get access to both the PS4 and the PS5 versions. Like its predecessor, Spider-Man Miles Morales is also rated T. T seems a bit high here, but I can kind of see why it would be rated this. I'd say it is tamer than the first game, and even it wasn't that bad in my opinion. All things considered, I'd put this as a really low T game. The story of Spider-Man Miles Morales finds itself in a weird space just from the start. It's a continuation of the story, but not exactly a sequel to the story of Spider-Man. This means that if you're coming off of the first Spider-Man game and expecting a story of the same impact and level of epicness, you're going to be a little disappointed. The stories the two games are trying to tell are very different because they're dealing with two different Spider-Men at two different points in their career. The first game was dealing with a somewhat seasoned Spider-Man dealing with an ever-growing series of threats that pushed him further than he had ever been pushed before. Miles is not there yet. This is a story about an inexperienced Spider-Man being on his own for the first time. It's about dealing with his first major issue as the only Spider-Man in New York City. This means that it is a smaller and tighter affair. I don't fault the game for that because it honestly makes a lot of sense to go that route. Just like the original game spends time looking at both sides of the main character, we see that here as well. The game is interested not just in Spider-Man, but the person under the mask. It's not just about going and saving the day, but about the connections that Miles has to his family, his friends, and his community that drives him to want to protect these things as Spider-Man. Since it is a shorter game overall, this means the focus on Miles maybe isn't as pronounced and developed as it was with Peter in the first game, but it is definitely still there and a substantial factor to the game. The danger that Miles has to face as Spider-Man here is a conflict between the corporation Roxxon and a criminal group called the Underground. The new reactor developed by Roxxon using a source of energy called Nuform seems to not be nearly as safe as they're claiming. The problem with the Underground, though, is that the methods they're using to try to stop Roxxon are dangerous in their own ways. So Miles has to navigate this conflict and try to solve it, which is a struggle as a rookie superhero and due to the conflict being more complicated than it seems on the surface. What results is a story that carves out its own place in the world of Marvel Spider-Man, but has its own growing pains. The story just feels forced at times, and some of the characters that are developed to be sympathetic didn't quite achieve that in my opinion. I'll give one example of what I mean that happens early on in the game in order to not give too many spoilers. So the game starts out with a massive battle against Rhino. Miles winds up taking Rhino down because Rhino is able to knock out Peter in the course of the battle. Miles's uncle, Aaron Davis, is able to tell that the new Spider-Man was Miles based on how he fought against Rhino. Now, this seems highly unlikely to me and only happens to connect Miles to his uncle and bring him into the story. Miles hasn't really had his uncle in his life for a while at that point, and Miles has also been training with Peter for a little while at this time, I think about a year. So these aspects would probably change the style that he would fight or move a little from when his uncle knew how he moved and would have been able to identify him by them. It just felt like it really just didn't make much sense other than as a quick way to get somebody to figure out that Miles was really Spider-Man. There are a handful of things like this through the game that just made me a little frustrated with an otherwise enjoyable narrative. Another example is that this game takes place over a super short period of time. It's like over the course of a Christmas break from high school, so a couple of weeks to a month at most. Yet both the Underground and Roxxon are able to develop countermeasures to Miles' newly developed powers in a few days. It just doesn't flow quite as nice as the different factions having different weapons in the first game. This is definitely a comic book / video game kind of logic here going on, but it just didn't feel as smooth, especially when compared to the first game. There are plenty of these nitpicks that I could focus on, but again, I did overall like the story. I just wished I didn't have these things that detracted a bit from the story for me. It's a fitting story for Miles' first outing on his own. It's just a little bumpy in places. Spider-Man Miles Morales is an interesting mix of old and new. Miles Morales keeps the basic combat and traversal from the first game, with a few tweaks here and there. But it was pretty seamless to move from playing the first Spider-Man game and coming into this one. The game also keeps the map system from the first game that makes the city easy to navigate, even if the map itself looks a little bit different in this one. And honestly, I kind of preferred the original Spider-Man's version a little bit more than the Miles Morales version, but it's not that big of a difference. Miles Morales also has a bunch of differences from the first Spider-Man. Some of these are good additions that had no downside, while others were a bit mixed. There were also a couple things I just didn't like the way they were changed. The best change to the gameplay, hands down, is the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man app. There was really no downside to this addition because it helps streamline crimes and other activities in just a very great, easy to use way. You want to take down a crime? Look it up in the app. It was just an awesome addition. What's also nice is that you can also run into crimes on your own too, which made crime feel more of a constant reality in the city instead of a do X number of crimes and then they're magically gone for good, or at least until a new faction gets introduced and you have to do crimes for them. I also like the connection of Peter's tutorial challenges to unlocking new Spider-Man abilities. This made a lot of sense and really gave a great feeling of Peter acting as teacher and mentor to Miles, which was just a really nice touch to the game. Another big change that didn't have a direct downside, at least, were Miles' unique powers. The addition of Venom and Camouflage were both fun additions to the gameplay. Venom was a pretty powerful attack that you could use in a number of different ways as you progressed, and Camouflage was a nice addition for the stealth sections of the game. There were maybe some indirect negatives due to this, but I'll get to those in a minute. The next change is one that I liked, but also had some complaints about as well, and that change is the streamlining of the token system. I did like that we only had 2 types of tokens instead of 6 like the first game, but this may have been too streamlined. The tech tokens seemed like they were gained at a good pace, and I didn't really have any problems with those. But the gaining of the activity tokens just didn't feel quite right compared to the amount you needed for upgrades. This was especially true because some of the activities didn't even happen until after the story, and made unlocking a portion of the content difficult to do until after the end of the story, unless you were really focusing on grinding crimes a lot. I also like some of the new activities to highlight Miles' personality, like the sampling. The bad thing with this activity in particular is that it felt really finicky at times. Sometimes it was kind of unclear what you needed to find, and then the distance would sometimes require you to be spot on, and the difference between too close and too far was not always very much. It was an interesting idea, and I did kind of like it in concept, but it just wasn't as enjoyable as I felt it could have been. Now, we're on to some of the changes that I didn't enjoy quite so much. Most of these stem from the inclusion of Venom and Camouflage in the game, and the way these systems seem to impact other parts of the gameplay. I felt like these aspects of Miles' gameplay were meant to be the focus of the game. We wanted people to focus on the Venom and using that to take down enemies, and the Camouflage to stealthily move around. So this made the skill tree focus heavily on these 2 abilities. But I felt like this made the skill tree feel much less consequential than in the first game. There was also the removal of suit powers, and our gadgets were reduced to 4 instead of 8. Now, I understand that the addition of Venom and Camo would probably require getting rid of some stuff, but this felt like a bit too much. It didn't help that a lot of the gadgets were just not nearly as much fun as the first game for me. One last thing that I didn't like was the fact that the final skill at each branch of the skill tree is locked until New Game Plus. This just felt really cheap, and I wasn't a huge fan of this move. It just added to the sense that Spider-Man Miles Morales had a weird sense of progression, and one that just wasn't super smooth. Now, it may sound like I really disliked the gameplay here, but that's not really the case. The game was a lot of fun, and so much of the base combat and movement carries over that it's already got a great foundation to it. A number of the changes were a little disappointing, but some, like the Spider-Man app, were a great quality of life improvement. If anything, it just felt like the game didn't quite know how to add the new abilities of Miles to what the first game already had, with like the suit powers and the gadgets and things like that. Like they didn't know quite how to balance those 2 aspects. Now, all this was probably in part also to make Miles feel unique and not having just the same gadgets and the same suit powers as Peter. It just didn't help that what we got, besides Venom, which was a lot of fun, just didn't feel quite as enjoyable to play around with as the gadgets and suit powers of the first game. Now, I played the first game on the PS4 and thought that it looked really nice. Spider-Man Miles Morales looks even better on the PS5. It's an amazing looking game, and with the extra focus on Harlem here, there just seems to be extra color and character to the game than I noticed in the first. In general, the art style is very similar to the first game, but I was impressed with how much better the game looked on a PS5 instead of the PS4 from the first version. Just like in the first game, I also enjoyed the wide, but not quite as wide as the first game's selection of suits for Miles to use. It's just a fun cosmetic aspect to the game that's interesting to play around with and find what your favorite suit or suits are to swing around New York. In terms of sound, the music of Spider-Man Miles Morales was more pronounced and noticeable here than in the first game. While I did like the music of the first game, I found the use of the soundtrack here to be much more integrated, and that's something I really tend to enjoy in games. In terms of other sound design, it follows the same excellent voice acting and general sound design as the first. I felt like the art and sound design behind Miles Morales was actually maybe a little better than the first game. There just seemed to be more places where I noticed the music, and even having the sampling quest line made the sound in the game become a focus in ways that the first game just didn't really do. Spider-Man Miles Morales and I had a rocky start. It was fairly early into the game where I had the menu totally freeze out on me. I was kind of worried that this would become a regular thing, but it never actually happened again after that one time. Other than the occasional enemy getting stuck in the environment, I never really had any other issues with the game at all. Just that one random freeze early on, but clear sailing after that. I also have to mention here that the load times from the original are completely gone. While those load times didn't really bother me that much from the first game, having them not be there at all was amazing. It was enjoyable to experience, even if I did kind of miss Spidey having some fun subway interactions. In many ways, Spider-Man Miles Morales is a victim to the success of the first Spider-Man. Miles Morales is a very solid game, but when compared to the first, it just doesn't feel quite as smooth in a number of ways. The story felt a bit rushed, and I didn't always like the direction it went in. Progression in the game also felt a little lacking, especially with some skills being locked behind completing the game first. Miles Morales does have some great additions to the game though, with Miles' special powers and the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man app. These bring some fun new powers and a much needed quality of life upgrade to the game. Even though some parts of the story felt off, it still felt like a fitting first venture for the newest Spider-Man in New York City. Do I think that this game was as good as the first Spider-Man? No, it didn't quite get there in my opinion. However, I'm still giving Spider-Man Miles Morales a 9 out of 10. It maybe didn't quite meet the levels of amazing that the first game did, but it was still very solid and added some good things to the game as well. I enjoyed my time with it a lot, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where they go next with both Peter Parker and Miles Morales in Spider-Man 2.
Pete, does this job ever get easier?
Some of it, yeah. Some things never get easier, though.